Good afternoon and welcome to our Energy Saving Trust webinar. It's good to have you with us. Thank you for making some time this afternoon. This webinar is titled How Can You Use Housing Stock Property and Energy Data to Inform Your Retrofit Strategies? It's part of our webinar series. We've had a few of those now and there's some more coming up, so please do feel free to check those out as well. Our webinar series is called It's Time to Decarbonise. So hopefully there's lots of value in there to be had from joining these sessions. My name is Jamie. I'm Senior Business Development Manager at the Energy Saving Trust, and I'm joined by a couple of my esteemed colleagues this afternoon who can help to give some insight into their expertise and the sorts of tools that Energy Saving Trust have that can support in this area. The session, as per lots of these webinars, is going to be recorded, so hopefully that's okay with everyone. If you have any questions throughout, we really do want to welcome those questions to be submitted via the questions box. So do feel free to do that at any time. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end, depending on sort of how long we've got left. We'll get through as many questions as we possibly can. If the Q&A format isn't for you, or if you'd like to have a bit more of an in-depth conversation with any of us, feel free to register your interest with the form in the chat box, and we'll set up a conversation for you as soon as possible once the webinar has finished. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to the first of my colleagues, Gordon, to take it from this point forward.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jamie. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jamie says, I'm Gordon Watts. I'm Technical Manager Low Carbon in the Insight team at Energy Saving Trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge that we're facing, why we're doing this stuff at all, why are we talking about this, and then the importance of data in supporting us on the journey. So just starting out, the colourful image at the top right, if you haven't seen it before, it's called Climate Stripes. And it's a very stark illustration of the climate change going on. It essentially, each bar represents a year and gives the average global temperature across the last couple of 100 years. And what is really stark is that end section where we're suddenly getting redder and redder and redder and deeper and deeper red. Now, I could go on at this point and show you lots of pictures of catastrophes happening around the world, but we all see those ourselves every day now, increasingly, and increasingly close to home as well. So I'm not going to do that. In terms of bringing it a bit closer to home, in terms of the UK, housing represents about 17 to 25% of UK's carbon emissions. Now, depends on which report you look at as to which figure you get, but it's roughly a fifth to a quarter of emissions are associated with housing. And so getting those decarbonised is of essence, really important in meeting the decarbonisation challenge. Bring it close to home still, social housing, there's the policy target of having no housing below EPC C by 2030, and then getting all housing to net zero carbon by 2050, which is an altogether bigger challenge, really. Next slide, please. Thanks, Nora. So where are we now? So this is a distribution of SAP ratings for properties across England. And what you can see is there's a smattering of A's and B's. There's a reasonable chunk of EPC Cs, but then there's this long tail of quite a lot of D's, then some E's, F's and G's. And the E's, F's and G's, there's a notable prominence of private rented sector in there. So there's a lot of properties to be brought up to at least that band C level in terms of fabric performance. There's then a separate issue is that the majority of that housing is on gas central heating. 3/4 roughly of all housings on gas central heating at the current time. And we need to get that away from gas onto a non-fossil fuel based heating source, whether that be heat pumps, possibly hydrogen boilers, possibly district heating. So it's a major challenge that we're facing. Next slide, please. So when you're starting to think about planning a retrofit campaign, there are many questions that you ask yourself. Now, I've sat in social housing looking at decarbonising stock for the portfolio I looked after for a number of years, and these are the kind of questions I was asking myself. Top dead centre always was, how are we going to pay for this? Then there's a really important one is, are our customers on the journey with us? Do they understand what we're asking? Do they understand what this means for them? Or do they want retrofit, really? Can we get them on that journey with us? There's then, what technical solution do we back? Is it heat pumps? Is it hydrogen boilers? We think here at Energy Saving Trust it is likely to be predominantly heat pumps, but there is uncertainty. You don't want to back the wrong horse and invest a load of money in the wrong technology. There's then, having retrofitted a home, how are you going to maintain it? What are the costs associated with maintaining a retrofitted home? Do we have the necessary skills in-house or access through contractors to do that? There's then questions of, right, okay, we've got thousands of properties that we need to tackle. Where do we start? Which homes do we tackle first? And how do we get the biggest bang for our buck? So in terms of, we've only got limited funds, where do we invest best, really, to achieve our targets? Coming down to an individual property level, what retrofit does that property need? What measures is it going to require? And who's going to do the work? Do we have the skills in-house? Do we have access to the supply chain, a sufficient supply chain? And are the skills there within that supply chain? And then the last one on there is, will energy bills be affordable for our customers at the end of all this? Nominally, you'd say a fabric retrofit should always make things better. But with current energy prices, the move to a heat pump isn't always quite as clear-cut. It can be a close thing at times. So if you can click, please, Nora. A lot of these questions can be informed and answered by good data and insight into that data. Not all of them, but having good data is a very strong place to start. And I'm going to move on and talk about that a little bit more. So going back not so long ago, if you talk to a housing professional, the question they'd always ask you, oh, what's your average SAP rating? What's it looking like now? And you'd draw a wobbly line on a graph and you'd have a number, a SAP rating. And that was normally in the context of, you got data which has included quite a lot of properties with no known SAP rating, no EPC against them, or equally expired EPCs. Honestly, that doesn't cut it anymore. It's not good enough for the challenge we're facing. Next slide, please. So what you're really now looking for is a rich mosaic of data to inform the decisions we need to make. So we're looking at energy performance data, and that's not the SAP rating, but the full RD SAP data, the detailed survey data that sits behind an EPC. You've got things like the stock investment plans, so that you can look for opportunities such as, for example, we're replacing a bathroom, or we're replacing bathrooms in these properties. It's a chance to get in and do internal wall insulation on these properties while the bathrooms are out. There's the general stock condition. If you've got a gable end like that, you're not going to put external wall insulation on it. But I've been in that situation, turning up to a property that looked like that. So you've got to know where the property's got to, you've got to make a property fit for taking the retrofit in the first place, but also opportunities like, right, we're going to need to re-roof that. That's an opportunity to perhaps do work on a room in roof or put PV panels on. There's planning considerations that might mean actually we can't do a particular measure there, or we're going to need to start planning, talking to planning early in order to be able to do what we want. And then very importantly, where are our vulnerable customers that we want to support most? Those with high IMD, those customers suffering fuel poverty. Next slide, please. So having got this rich picture of data for your stock portfolio, you're then saying, right, how do we interpret that? And you really need data modeling. If you're just looking at a few properties, you can do this manually. When you're looking at hundreds and thousands of properties, you need data modeling capability. And that's answering questions like, what are my archetypes? Where are the clusters of my worst properties that inform where I should be starting? What measures am I going to need to hit target, and how do I future-proof those so that if I do a partial retrofit now, I'm not doing abortive work that I'm going to have to undo before I can go on to the next step to net zero carbon. Then there's the things about how much carbon will I save? What will customer bills be afterwards? How much is it all going to cost me to do this work? And importantly, again, what impact this is going to have on my customer fuel bills? And this is the kind of stuff that data modeling can give you. So next slide, please. Moving on, the last thing, but you're saying, hang on a minute, but every property is different, isn't it? When it comes down to it, and it's absolutely true. You can look at a row of terraces and they're all nominally identical, but they are all different. And when it comes down to actually delivering a retrofit campaign, you need to get in and do retrofit assessments and really understand the detail of those properties. But what this big data is bringing you down a funnel to get you into the broad areas of properties you need to retrofit, that then supports you in the work of saying, right, we're going to retrofit these properties, and then you go in and do the retrofit assessments. And I'm going to pass on at this stage, thank you for that, listening everybody, to Sean, who's going to talk to you a bit more about how do we overcome this data challenge. Over to you, Sean. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gordon. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Lemon. I'm the Senior Manager of the Data and Digital team at Energy Saving Trust. So building off of Gordon's discussion there on the data challenge, I'll be discussing some ways we can overcome this with some specific references to the housing stock data and modeling services that we provide. Now, from our experience working with social housing providers, we typically break this problem down into 3 components or phases. So building an evidence base, exploring scenarios, and then creating a plan. So when we say building an evidence base, this involves collecting relevant data sets on the housing stock, and this can include property level data, energy efficiency data sets, as well as socioeconomic or demographic data sets, although these typically are only available at the small area level. Now, this information allows us to build a housing stock database or an asset management system, which can be used to conduct a baseline study to understand the current conditions of the housing stock. It also enables benchmarking against regional or national trends and helps to identify unique opportunities or challenges for retrofit and also evaluate progress over time. Now, once we have the evidence base in place, we can then explore different retrofit scenarios. So this involves translating policy objectives, whether they be net zero or regulatory targets around reaching EPC Band C or minimum energy efficiency standards, into model parameters. And then using housing stock data along with energy modeling software, we can recommend property improvements. We can estimate the potential costs and savings and the impact on efficiency of undertaking those retrofit measures. And ultimately, we can evaluate how well the scenario will achieve the intended targets or outcomes. And then by comparing different scenarios over time, we're able to identify an optimal pathway with indicative costs and savings to help achieve that end goal. This then sets up the 3rd phase. So when at this point, you can use the evidence base as well as the insights from the scenario modeling to inform local strategies on net zero, fuel poverty strategies, and even local area energy plans. So for example, you could use this data to build a retrofit pipeline by identifying hotspots of properties that are suitable for specific interventions. You could also use this to identify the types of jobs or skills required to deliver the retrofit work, which can then inform future investment in supply chain development and training. You'd also be able to allocate funding more efficiently and identify areas that may be suitable for trialing new or innovative forms of green funding and finance. Now, as I've mentioned before, we have worked with a number of housing associations as well as local authorities at various scales, so county councils, combined authorities, to help overcome their data challenge and move along this journey. And given the importance of those first 2 phases in the pipeline I just discussed, I'm going to highlight 2 products that we offer to help support our clients. So on the left here, you can see we have Home Analytics, which is an address level housing stock database, which covers all homes in Great Britain. It really streamlines the process of building the evidence base and enables us to immediately start creating a baseline for your stock and also identifying these potential opportunities and challenges for retrofit. On the right, we have our Portfolio Energy Assessment tool, otherwise known as PEAT, which we use to help investigate different retrofit strategies. Essentially, it's an energy modeling tool that enables us to test different retrofit scenarios on batches of properties to help estimate potential costs and savings, and ultimately recommend an optimal pathway for achieving your intended policy goals. Now, before I go into more detail about these products and give examples of how we've used them in the past, it's important to note that there are other organizations out there that offer similar types of data and services. We always advise potential clients to do their due diligence to ensure they find a service provider that will offer value for money and deliver exactly what they need. With that said, I'll give a bit more detail around our products. So I'll start with Home Analytics, which again is a property database. It contains over 95 variables of information for each property in Great Britain, including key elements such as the unique property reference number, or UPRN, the address, as well as other geographical identifiers, which allow the data to be connected to other data sources. It also includes things like property attributes, so things like property type, built form, floor area, and height. It includes information on energy efficiency measures, such as wall, floor, loft insulation, glazing, fuel type, and heating system. It includes indicators for low carbon heating systems, so it would identify if a property is suitable for air source or ground source heat pumps, solar PV, solar thermal, or biomass boilers. There's also information around the SAP characteristics of the property. So this is things like the EPC score, the environmental impact rating, the SAP modeled energy consumption, fuel bill, and CO2 emissions values. And then lastly, there's socioeconomic indicators. So this includes things like the index of multiple deprivation, fuel poverty, tenure, and benefit claimant counts, which can be really useful when juxtaposed with the actual property dimensions and attributes. Now, the database is populated with information from over 17 unique data providers. You can see on this graphic here, we've called out some of the more prevalent ones. So we've got the likes of Ordnance Survey, Royal Mail, the EPC Register, Land Registry, Office for National Statistics, and Department for Work and Pensions. So there's a lot of data coming together to form this database. Where possible, these data sets are joined together using the UPRN, so at the address level. But in some cases, we don't have a UPRN for some of these data sets. We have to make use of other geographical codes to bring these data sets together. Sometimes that'll also involve address matching, so using the actual addresses and trying to match them to a UPRN to make sure we're pulling in as much data as possible into the model. Now, to address cases where there are multiple records that exist for a single property from different data sources, we consider elements such as data currency, so prioritizing sources that are more current. We consider trust of the data set, representativeness, as well as coverage across the area we're looking at to determine how these data sources should be prioritized. Now, one of the hallmarks of the database is that it covers all properties, not just the 60 or 65% of properties that have an EPC record. So coming back to what Gordon was discussing there about that blind spot of unknown properties. So with those properties, we essentially fill the gaps in the EPC record by using a series of models to fill those gaps. And we also include metadata within our database that identifies confidence levels, EPC date stamps, and flags so that users can understand what data has been modeled, what data has come directly from an EPC or another source, and they can see the relative confidence in those values, which will help make better use of the data. Now, Home Analytics is available as an annual data license that can be provided in various formats, such as a CSV, a geodatabase, or a shapefile if you're trying to bring it into a GIS software program. It can also be delivered as a Power BI dashboard. We can also provide a stock overview report that benchmarks your stock against regional and national trends, again, pulls out these unique local opportunities and challenges for retrofit and decarbonization, and maps out hotspots of key attributes within the stock. The data is also available as an API, which can be integrated into digital advice tools to enhance the user journey. So a number of different use cases depending on what your needs are. And now I'll move on to PEAT. So once you have that evidence base established with Home Analytics, we then use PEAT to convert property information into standard SAP inputs, so the same types of fields that go into an EPC assessment. We then run these through our SAP-based calculation engine called the Dynamic Engine, which helps us to determine an optimal package of improvements for each property based on a set of scenario parameters. Now, the main parameter we might use in one of these models is a target. So this could be expressed in various ways, such as an EPC band score that you want to achieve, could be a CO2 emissions value you want to achieve, or it could be a heat demand target. There are then other parameters and outputs or inputs that we can adjust to further tailor the scenario. So we can look at things like the measure list. You can decide which measures you want to include or exclude within the scenarios, the order in which they should be considered, the cost of each measure, as well as any per property budgets that you want to impose within the scenario. Now, the result is an ordered list of recommended measures at the property level. And for each property, Pete estimates the measure costs, the savings in terms of energy saved, CO2 emissions saved, and fuel bill savings, as well as the EPC score improvement. Pete is capable of processing portfolios of hundreds of thousands of properties, so there isn't a reliance on property archetypes. We can look at each property individually, which is a kind of a unique aspect of Pete. The outputs can then be plotted over time to simulate the temporal impact of undergoing retrofit work. So for example, for a local authority that's aiming to achieve net zero by 2050, we can split the required retrofit work up over the next 27 years and then forecast the required investment and CO2 emissions levels over that time period. So it's not just a snapshot in time, it's looking out as far as you need to with your targets and policy objectives. Now, typically how this works is we'll host a series of workshops with the client and any other relevant stakeholders, essentially forming a steering group for the project. And we'll scope out scenarios and the model parameters. We'll then process these scenarios in Pete and provide the outputs of the models in the client's preferred format. So this, again, could be Excel, it could be Power BI. It's quite flexible. We also offer a Pete report, which summarizes the methodology and the scenarios we've considered. It compares the scenario outputs. It forecasts the costs and savings over time, and then it also recommends next steps. So if we come back to that initial workflow I was showing on that first slide, you can see that Home Analytics and Pete can both help support those first two phases within the process. Now, how these insights then are taken forward in the third phase will depend on the client's needs and kind of, where they see things going in the future. So this could include a retrofit pipeline, it could include decarbonization plan, it could include a local area energy plan. For some councils we've worked with, we've developed a business plan or a delivery model for one-stop shop energy advice service. It really depends, usually will depend on the outcomes of the first two phases, but the direction that the council or the social housing provider wants to take will typically dictate that third step in the process. But sometimes we'll be able to help, other times you may work internally or with other delivery partners, which is totally fine. So yeah, I hope that kind of explains the data challenge a bit more. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Jamie now, who will bring this all to life a bit with a real world case study. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to Gordon and Sean there for setting the context and kind of hopefully translating the ethos of how we work at the Energy Saving Trust for this challenge. And I thought just to contextualize why we're doing this and how we're supporting our clients, we have a huge challenge in the sense that if we're looking to be net zero by 2050, the current rate of development of properties needs to be 617,000 properties every single year. And if we move it on a little bit, if we get a bit more ambitious and we look for a target date of 2035, obviously the number significantly jumps up. So, it's the right time now to be taking action. And fortunately, there are multiple services out there that can help you to do that. So, if you can move on, please. So we're lucky enough to work with lots of different local authorities and social housing groups, but also commercial clients, banking sector, energy supply, and some of which I can see in the attendees list, so it's lovely to see you again. The case study I'm going to go through with you very quickly is the North of Tyne Combined Authority. So we were lucky enough to work with them, and they, alongside a couple of project partners. So can move on, please, Nora. Before I do that, there's just a quick mental game to play here. We did another project recently where the average cost of upgrades of homes to get from below a C to a C was a certain figure. I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a guess at what that might be. Yeah, if you can move on, Nora, please. It was £23,300. So it's not an insurmountable amount, particularly when you look at the size of a potential housing stock. It's a figure of money that doesn't grow on trees and needs to be found somewhere. And that's why making important decisions based upon as much data as possible is absolutely essential, so that every penny is maximised and not wasted, obviously, which is what nobody wants. So I'll talk now a little bit more about the North of Tyne Combined Authority. So we it's split across 3 regions, so Newcastle, North of Tyne and Northumberland, and there's obviously a significant volume of homes across that area. Now, If you move on, please. So we started with targets. We worked with the steering group to understand what the targets were for the region, and very, very ambitious. As you can see there, the third target there is achieve net zero by 2030, so an even quicker rate than probably most are targeting, which is great and should absolutely be applauded. But that obviously meant that we had to create a plan as quickly as we possibly could, because the other targets were 100,000 new green jobs would be created across the region, and we were going to look to how do we best retrofit 100,000 homes. So every region has its own challenge, and I'm sure you have your own targets. Obviously, probably different to this, but the theory is the same. We need to understand where we are today in order to best plan for tomorrow and beyond, towards 2030 and beyond. So if you could move on, please, Nora. So the starting point, so Sean has given you an idea as to what our tools do, and so we slice and dice the housing stock across north of Tyne to reach archetypes, and there were 67,000 of them. And there were really two scenarios that we wanted to explore. One was, what happens if we just continue with business as usual? So in other words, the current rate of retrofit, the current finance, what would that achieve? And then the second scenario was, well, how do we get to net zero? So using the tools that Sean has described, how much extra finance needs to go in? What type of technologies do we need to start preparing for? And so the tool analysed the optimal packages of retrofit for each different property, and it could give uplifts for each property, but also for the region as a whole, which enabled us to understand how we can move things forward. So challenges. There are inevitably challenges with a project such as this. So 80,000 homes will need to be retrofitted per year between 2027, by 2027, sorry, which is 10 times the current rate. That's something that doesn't just happen because you want it to. Serious plans need to be put in place to help achieve that sort of thing. And so the cost of achieving net zero was an estimated £13 billion worth of funding additional to that of BAU. So whilst these numbers are obviously fairly scary potentially, that's the reality. And so by understanding that and knowing what the financial gap is, that enables you to start thinking about innovative finance models, or working with delivery partners to help bring that down. And electrifying heat through the mass deployment of heat pumps, although as Gordon says, we think it's the most likely technology to have the greatest potential for impact, it won't actually enable NTCA to achieve net zero by 2030. So with any challenge, there is the second side of the coin, which is opportunities. And so 10.2 jobs supported for every £1 million spent. So that is, putting significant investment back in the people of the region and going towards that target of hitting 100,000 green jobs. That's going to really hopefully give the economy a boost and create lots of new jobs for people. So that's the positive side. Peak labour requirements will by 2050 will reach 10k jobs in 2036. So again, we've got to start preparing now for potential skill shortages that might be realised if we don't put plans in place to deal with them later down the line. And so a net zero approach, although obviously we've got to find the money to be able to deliver upon that and get the plan right to do so. If we do that, the benefits are quite amazing in the sense that you can jump the average EPC band up to a high B, which is absolutely phenomenal. And hopefully, I guess we're all hoping that we can get our regions to that level at some point. So moving forward, just the final couple of bits. So the recommended actions that came on the back of the work that we did with them, obviously adopt a fabric first approach. I don't think that would surprise anybody on the webinar this afternoon. But to consider a blend of council-led and regional retrofit programs. So in other words, don't try to do everything yourselves. Look at how we can all collaborate and work together, bring in financial partners, banking groups, local delivery specialists, that sort of thing. By working together, we have a better chance of creating programs that actually encourage action. And identify the most common types of multi-owner mixed-use buildings. Could be potentially quite tricky to unlock funding for that sort of building type. So how tackling those is going to be key. And final couple of bits then. So target owner-occupied homes. About 75% of homes in England and Wales that are below a SAT band C are owner-occupied. So it's fantastic. There's lots of drivers to help local authorities, but the owner-occupied market is really where there's a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge. We need to get our communications right, look at how we can explore things like property-linked finance potentially and other innovative models to help homeowners to take that step of selecting renewables for their homes. And yeah, as I sort of touched on this already, but direct investment towards the skill areas that will be most in demand. And that's what data should do at this point. Data and the data modeling as to what could happen in the future should help to better make those decisions, to plan for what the level of skills is locally at the moment. How many people do we have to fit an SLC pump across a region, for example, and how many does that need to be by 5 years time, 10 years time. And so having the data at hand will really hopefully help you to make those educated decisions, so that really moving forward, you're doing so with the highest level of confidence you possibly can. So the final thing for us this afternoon is just to kind of reiterate our ethos, I suppose. Measure is where you start. You cannot do anything without measuring where you are accurately, or as accurately as possible. And of course, we need to plan best to deliver upon what the data is telling us and deliver on our targets that we all know that we have. And then act is, of course, let's go, let's do it. Let's get our delivery partners in place and let's make this happen, because time waits for no man. So that's the end of our presentation section. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to put a poll, I believe, into the chat now. So if I could ask you kindly to submit your answers, it would really help us to make our future webinars even better and hopefully more valuable for everyone that's joining. And we'll move on to our Q&A section once that's happened. So just a few seconds left. Thank you to everyone that's taken the time to do that. Hopefully you found it useful this afternoon. Just while that poll is in progress, I just wanted to again highlight that in the chat function there is a form that you can fill out if you'd like to speak to Gordon, Sean and I about anything you've heard today, or even anything outside of this. Be really open and happy to having a conversation with you. So we have a Q&A session, so I think it's only fair that we deal with the questions that came in before the webinar to give people a chance to get those answers, and then I'll move on to the live chat. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question. So the first question I'm going to pose to you, Gordon, if that's okay. So thanks. Is data better than door-to-door community engagement with residents for improving uptake? It's an interesting question.
They are both. So at a real politician's answer, I'm going to say they are both really important, but they perform different functions. What the data does is it allows you to target the properties where you can best achieve your impacts. You set your targets and which properties we're going to most need to tackle to achieve our targets, and that's fine. That's initially it's a desktop exercise. Then you go on to retrofit assessments, but really it's a desktop exercise. But you've got to talk to customers. You've got to talk to residents in homes to have them on the journey with you. It's what I talked about earlier. It's not about doing retrofit to people. It's about taking people on the journey with you. So community engagement is vitally important when it comes to the point of we know which properties we want to retrofit. Now we need to turn that into an executable plan. But you need to be able to identify the properties in the first place, which is what the data supports.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Thank you. So Sean, the next one, if I can throw over to you. So how best to integrate a housing stock decarbonisation plan with a local area energy plan?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and we're really seeing a lot of these local area energy plans being produced these days. So it is a really topical question, and it's not a service that we currently provide, but it's definitely one that our data can feed into, or any kind of housing stock or decarbonization plan could feed into, and we kind of see that working in a couple ways. So on the one hand, you can use the data or the outputs from a retrofit scenario analysis to identify areas that might be better suited through a communal heating approach rather than targeting individual buildings with heat pumps, let's say. You could also identify areas that might put a strain on the electricity grid in the future. If the retrofit scenario is saying all these homes in this area are going to get heat pumps in the next 5 or 10 years, then that's going to dramatically change the electricity demand in that area, which therefore might require collaboration with the local DNO to understand what that impact will be on the load and the grid in that area. So I think they're definitely complementary services. I would kind of see the housing stock analysis and the retrofit analysis as the first piece in that puzzle, and then that would then feed into a work stream like a local area energy plan that could make use of that data more broadly across the council area, for example.
Great, thanks, Sean. So just a couple more then. So I guess Gordon or Sean, either of you, if you'd like to take this one. So funding works. How to prioritise properties when there can be very difficult issues or challenges for different housing? Who would like to take that one?
I'll take the first bit, thinking about how funding works. Say I used to sit in a social housing seat. I was a sustainability manager for a housing association, so I'm very aware of that issue. How are you going to pay for this stuff? I mean, there's two things I would say on that. Is obviously funding is changing all the time, particularly central government funding. The schemes that are coming through, whether it's SHDF or it's LAD or it's HUG, it's changing all the time. But what you can use is you can use data to identify the timescales that come with the funding bids are normally very, very short and require a very quick turnaround. And you find yourself scrabbling about thinking, right, okay, what properties have we got that we can fit into this particular funding regime? So having sound data in the first place and that's not just talking about the property, that's talking about the property, and that's also talking about the people that live in them, in those properties, can help you identify which properties are going to be eligible for funding. So having that data on hand is really, really valuable, because I've found myself crawling through individual EPCs before now, trying to build that data set to go for funding bids. I wished I'd had a full data set that I could just analyze. Second thing about that funding is increasingly lenders want to know about the properties that they are mortgaging within housing portfolios, and so you're having to provide evidence on particular portfolios for a given, say, building society about, right, these are the properties that you are mortgaging, and being able to pull that data through. And that's assuring existing funding, but also there's an increasing move towards ESG linked funding. And again, that is all relating to how do your properties perform now and how are you planning to improve them. So again, that's looking at the data as it stands now and being able to map out what your retrofit plans are. So again, that is all wrapped up. I mean, you say funding, what's that got to do with data? Well, it's got a lot to do with data, it turns out, in those kind of ways. Sean, I don't know if you want to talk about the prioritization issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot there, Gordon. I would say there's different ways to prioritize homes for retrofit. It's going to vary by tenure. It's going to vary by the nature of the stock. It's going to vary by the clustering of these homes, because you're not going to be going all around an area doing one home here, one home there. You're going to look for economies of scale, and we've done a lot of work in Scotland around supporting local authorities with their area-based schemes, and that's a really effective way of delivering retrofit on scale. So that's typically an approach we would recommend, is looking for areas or neighborhoods of homes that require similar types of interventions, and then kind of grouping them together, whether it be for one of the existing public funding pots of money out there, or if it's to demonstrate or to test some of these more innovative green financing offers. It's going to depend on the nature of the stock and exactly the type of intervention you need to undertake in those properties. But I think that's one area where the data can help as well, is identifying those hot spots and using the information from the housing stock database or from a scenario analysis to either complete a funding bid or to make the case to private investors for securing that funding.
Just to briefly add to what you're saying there, Sean, thank you. I would say ultimately, data can't tell you what your targets and priorities are. That is for you as a housing organisation to decide. What they can do is inform setting those targets and help you work out how you're best going to meet the targets. But they can't ultimately tell you what your priorities are. That's a policy thing or something that gets decided at board.
Yeah,
yep, really good point.
Yes, good point. Thanks, guys. And so there's just one last one that was submitted before the webinar, and that was around the future of EPC. So any thoughts on future SAP EPC changes and how we model for them? So probably fits maybe in your ballpark here, Sean.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I mean, it's something we are looking at in terms of making sure our modeling software like Pete can accommodate the new SAP methodology in kind of a shorter term world, but longer term we're also involved in projects that go beyond EPCs, go beyond SAP. As we know, there's a lot of issues with SAP assessment software. It serves a purpose. EPCs are important. They're tied to targets, but they don't necessarily do everything we need them to do. So there is going to be, I think, the introduction of new metrics in the future, looking, more at the actual building performance to really understand heat demand in buildings. I think smart meter data poses a really important opportunity to kind of really tie into that, rather than relying on kind of estimated annual averages of energy consumption, getting that actual metered consumption, and then being able to understand the impact of that on heat demand or heat requirements of a building. That's kind of where we see this going in the future. So we're continuing to develop our data and tools so that we can, provide that insight as and when the SAP methodology changes in the future.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, not an exact science, but I think there's lots of different ways that we've been looking to overcome any potential challenges there. So thank you. So we're on to the live questions. Now, apologies to everyone, we've only got 2 minutes left. So we're not going to get a chance to go through every single one of them. If we don't get a chance to touch on a question, we will respond to you offline. So thank you for submitting them. So Sean, probably one for you here as well. There's a question here. Does the service, I'm assuming it's Home Analytics, cover Scotland?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one we get a lot, actually. Currently, it just covers England and Wales, and that's largely because of the fact that EPC data is kind of managed differently between England and Wales and Scotland. So currently we do deliver a version of Home Analytics for Scottish local authorities and for Scottish government, but because it's directly licensed to social housing providers in Scotland, it's not something that we make commercially available. We are looking at developing kind of a secondary service in Scotland that would be separate from that public offering that could be made available commercially. So it is something that's on our radar and something we're keen to deliver in the future, but it's not something currently that we're supporting at this time.
Great, thank you. And so maybe one final one. How much of a role do you see for smart technologies installed in properties to help collect data going forward?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one too. It's something, we're quite keen to explore more. I think we talk a lot about digital twins and essentially having a two-way flow of information from a home. So not just relying on static building data that's updated once a year or every 10 years when a new EPC is issued for a property, but instead having real-time flows from sensors. So collecting information on indoor air temperature, indoor air quality, and really that kind of tie-in and building models off of that will enable us to potentially identify homes that, at risk of fuel poverty or at risk of underheating, of other kind of health conditions. So when we talk about healthy homes, I think real-time data and from sensors is going to be crucial for kind of pushing that forward. It's not something that's broadly available at this point, but we are involved in various trials to to start building models around this, because we do see it as a a really important area going forward.
Just to add to that one, I would also say it allows real-time data allows test and learn as you retrofit properties. So that for a long time we've sort of looked at the EPC before and the EPC after, and that's your performance difference. But we all know there's the performance gap and things don't perform exactly. Well, the building wasn't performing exactly as the EPC suggested before the retrofit. So there's no reason to suggest an EPC after a retrofit is going to accurately represent how a building performs. So having real-time data, so you can actually see the real impact of different measures. And as I say, the test and learn approach. So as you go through a program of retrofitting hundreds and thousands of properties, you gradually refine your approach, you improve your approach, you try different products. Because obviously there's going to continue to be innovation in retrofit products as time goes by. And so it gives you, it's a real measure of what the real impact that people are really going to feel on the ground ultimately, and it allows you to improve over time what you do.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Sean. Some excellent questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them. We will respond to you offline. And obviously our webinar is drawn to a close. Perhaps we need to allow a bit more time for Q&A next time. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining this afternoon. We hope that you'd maybe consider joining a future Energy Saving Trust webinar, so do feel free to check those out. And again, the offer of any sort of support, an initial conversation, exploratory chat is open. So please do use the form in the chat function. Thank you to Gordon, thank you to Sean. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll hopefully see you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.